Why have a lot of people got polearm shafts absolutely wrong? In a way, that means that a lot of replica or reproduction polearm shafts aren't actually historically accurate. Well, you might think that I'm talking about the type of wood or perhaps the cross-section, but no, I'm actually talking about taper. So in this video we're going to look at 5 reasons why many polearms from around the world and across history have tapered shafts, or indeed really want to have tapered shafts to work to their maximum effect. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now in this channel we often look at polearm types of various types from across history, all the way back into prehistory, through the ancient world, medieval, and even all the way up to the modern day. And it should be patently clear, I think, to most people who've studied anything to do with military history, that polearms in their many different forms have been some of the primary weapons throughout history. And yet, given that fact, really, they receive remarkably little attention from historians and casual students of weapons. And there's one very important factor which often gets missed, and that is their shafts. Now indeed, there are many variables within shafts, obviously length, thickness, the cross-section. For example, this has a rectangular cross-section for reasons of edge alignment, particular to things like poleaxes, halberds and partisans, where you want to cut with them. But one thing that often gets overlooked is the subject of taper. And I think a lot of people simply don't even think about it, or don't know that actually when we look at historical, genuine, antique or archaeologically found polearms, there is very often a considerable amount of taper along the shaft. Now many of you will know that arrows very often have taper. In fact, not modern target arrows, which are usually completely parallel, but traditional arrows made of wood are very often either thicker at the front or thicker at the middle for various different reasons, to do with strength and integrity of the arrow when hitting hard targets like armour, or indeed for flight path and the way you want the arrow to balance in the air in order to gain more range. That's a fascinating topic in its own right, which we might cover in a separate video, or maybe I'll do it as a collaboration with another YouTuber. But most people accept that arrows have taper on them, and I think everybody knows that obviously something like a grip on a sword has taper on it for various different reasons. Sometimes they're thicker at the bottom, sometimes thicker at the top, sometimes they have a bulge in the middle for various different benefits. So let's look at 5 reasons why you might want taper on a polearm shaft. And very briefly, before we jump into those 5 reasons, I want to mention that this original Napoleonic spontoon, which I featured in a video recently, is a good example of a polearm which doesn't have any taper. So I don't want you to go away from this video thinking that all polearm shafts are tapered. In fact, most poleaxe shafts, like that poleaxe I was just holding, or this spontoon shaft, aren't tapered. They are parallel edged. But that being said, an enormous number of other polearms are tapered. So let's look at 5 reasons why. So the first reason why a shaft might be tapered is quite simply to do with a product of manufacturing. In other words, what the material is, what's it's made of, how's it made, and how's it harvested. So in some cases, shafts like this on this Zulu or South African spear here are thicker at one end and thinner at the other. Now I should mention that this is an Iklewa, sometimes known as an assegai, but that's more the throwing spear. But the Iklewa usually has actually a thicker shaft than this, is usually thicker at the back end. But this particular one is tapered down, and we do actually find this with a number of African and other world spears where they get thinner towards the back end. And sometimes this is simply because these are pollarded pieces of branch, essentially, that are grown off the top of a pollarded tree. Not always, they can be manufactured like this, we'll get to that in a second, but in some cases, because the nature of the material that's been used, it naturally gets from thicker to thinner. Now another example of this is this Victorian lance, the 1868 pattern lance. This hasn't been seen publicly on this channel before because it's a new acquisition of mine. It's been seen by the Patreons, incidentally, on Patreon, link down below. But this is made of bamboo, specifically male bamboo. You might think, what do you mean male bamboo? Yes, it does have a gender. So bamboo comes in 2 genders, male and female. The male bamboo is solid, and it's basically the preferred wood for lances or spears or anything like that. So actually most of the bamboo you might buy at the garden centre, for example, would be female and hollow. It's not so strong and it's lighter as well. So this is, although bamboo is technically not a wood, it's more like a wood because it's solid. solid. And because of course the way that bamboo grows, you've all seen it growing in bushes and forests, it is thicker at one end than the other. So by natural selection, this cavalry lance, which is over 9 feet long incidentally, which is why I'm filming outdoors, is thicker at one end than the other, purely because it's made of bamboo. But that's not to say that's not the only reason that they wanted this to be tapered, but we'll come back to that in a second. Now, I mentioned that manufacturing can also lead to a tapered shaft. In other words, how the weapon is put together. And an example that you may not know about is axes. Okay, now most of you are familiar with the way that axes are generally put, the head is generally put down from the head and a wedge is put in at the top, and this was certainly done a lot historically. I don't want you to think that all axes were not made like that historically. Many were. However, we know that many other axes, for example, tomahawks are one example, or indeed there are a certain family of these large sort of Dane axes, as they're commonly known these days, or great axes, from bogs in Ireland where the shafts actually survive. And in those cases, the shafts are thin at one end and thick at the other, and the axe head is slid on at the thin end and it comes up to the fat end until it can't go any further, and then probably banged on a stump to get it nice and solid. It can even be wedged from underneath to keep it there if you need to, or it could be pinned through as well, but they are slid up from below. So various types of axes, including tomahawks and certain Viking era axes, and various other axes from around the world, in fact, have been slid on from below, and therefore the shaft is actually a very elongated cone. It has to be thin at one end, fat at the other, so the shaft can be slid on, the head can be slid on and won't fly off the end. So the second reason why you might want to taper a shaft is quite simply that you don't need thickness in the whole length of the weapon, and this is very much true in the case of this type of 19th century lance. We've got a thicker end at the back, and obviously you would find this also with medieval and Renaissance lances, which are thick at the back and thinner at the tip. You wouldn't want them thick all the way along because they'd be hugely heavy. So fundamentally, the second point here is weight, and obviously weight also relates to speed and nimbleness. Okay, the lighter you can make the weapon, the more manageable it is to carry around and transport, but also the quicker it is to maneuver, so lighter at the tip. This is very similar, in fact, to the concept of distal taper that we experience with swords. That obviously if you have more mass towards the tip, it's going to hit with more authority, but the sword is going to move more slowly. You can't accelerate it as quickly. It's just generally not as nimble to use. So a polearm of any kind that you can reduce any mass from is going to be lighter and quicker. Now, that's not to say that you want all polearms to necessarily be as light and quick as possible, because sometimes you want them to hit hard. We'll come back to that later. However, if you want a polearm to be lighter and quicker and more nimble, then reducing mass from it somewhere is an advantageous thing. And therefore, of course, reducing mass from up near the tip, where you don't need it, could be very advantageous. Now, closely related to that point, of course, is balance, because if you have reduced mass in one part of the weapon, but you've kept it in another, or added it in another part of the weapon, you'll notice that this lance, like many polearms, actually has a ferrule on the back end, so that's acting like a counterbalance or pommel. That means that the point of balance comes further back. So not only is this overall a lighter weapon because it has a tapered shaft and is therefore relatively more nimble with the tip. It's not a particularly nimble weapon, but it's more nimble than it would be otherwise because it's tapered. It changes the balance and brings the point of balance back, which also assists the nimbleness of the weapon. So in other words, if we just reduced mass evenly from the weapon, yes, it would make it more nimble, but because we've reduced mass from one end and not the other end, or you could view it as moving mass from one end to the other end, it means that this is overall balanced much more towards the back, much more manageable, less tiring weapon to use, and a lot quicker fundamentally. But that has another really important advantage. So I'm going to put the lance down and we're going to pick up the spontoon. Okay, now the spontoon is a fairly top heavy weapon. Okay, and you'll notice that it doesn't have a tapered shaft, it has a parallel shaft, and it doesn't have any counterbalance at the back end. In fact, some of them do have a shoe at the back end which helps balance them, but this is a fairly front heavy weapon. Okay, now if I was someone who was using a shield, let's pick up a shield to illustrate this point. Okay, so I've got here my Norman shield. This is not a weapon that was used with a shield, incidentally. This is of course a two-handed spear, a spontoon. So here I've got my shield. Now imagine that I'm fighting other people with spears and shields. So I'm using this weapon here. If I hold it at the point of balance, look how short my reach is. Most of my weapon is sticking out of the back. It's rubbish. It's a really, really bad spear for this purposes. The head is too heavy. It's got no counterbalance at the back. I really want to be having this sort of reach with the weapon, but it's completely unwieldy to use it like that. Now, interestingly, although it's completely historically inaccurate, but because it balances completely differently, now let's switch to the cavalry lance. Now, hilariously, although this is supposed to be used on horseback with an enormous, great long reach like that, I can actually quite comfortably use this with a shield. Okay, so because it's so back balanced, it's actually fantastically long reaching to use with a shield. So if I have to use a spear in one-handed, particularly, this would also go for two-handed, but particularly if I have to use it in one hand, it means that overhand or underhand, I've now got a huge reach because my spear is back weighted. And that's not necessarily always done with metal mass at the back. It can be, but it can be entirely done with the taper of the shaft. If you make the shaft light at the front and thick at the back, it will give you literally 1, 2, even 3 feet of extra reach. Now, of course, there is another family or subset of polearms which are primarily striking weapons. Okay, I'm going to put the poleaxe down and I'll use the Danax to illustrate this. So, when we have a weapon which is predominantly swinging or striking, this could apply to things like bills as well. And in fact, I'll come back to the Mary Rose bills in a second. Very often, the priority in this case is making sure that our shaft stays in one piece and is strong, okay? So what we often find with striking polearms, and it has to be said tools as well, agricultural tools, is the shaft is actually thicker at the striking end. So the opposite of the cavalry lance. Instead of being back weighted and thick at the back end, they're actually thick at the top striking end. And the reason is, with this type of weapon, there is a huge amount of torque, of stress coming through this part of the shaft. And so if I just pick the poleaxe up for a second, that is exactly why these languettes are here. People often fixate on this protecting from cuts from other weapons, which it also does. But in my view, the primary purpose of these languettes, and we find them on halberds as well and things like partisans, is actually to keep the head attached to the shaft. Because when we use these in HEMA or reenactment, we usually see these break around here. This is where they usually break, okay? Unless they have languettes, and the languettes protect that from happening. And I have even seen ones break in the wood, but the languettes keep the head attached to the shaft, even though the wood's broken inside. So, what we find is there is a whole family of cutting polearms, things like axes, bills, Lochaber axes, Sparth axes, bardishes, things like this, which are actually tend to be tapered with the thick end at the head, okay? So they taper down here, and then of course they're thinner at the bottom because you don't need that thickness down there, so you may as well reduce mass from the total weapon. So the next reason why you might have a tapered shaft is purely because you're beefing up that stress point underneath the head. And sometimes, you know, as I say, we see metal reinforcement to assist that, but if you don't put metal reinforcement on, then often just thickening the shaft will achieve the same goal. And we should also mention at that point, marrying the last 2 points, which were balance and strength. In this case, if we have a weapon which is primarily designed to give great big blows, then not only have you made this end of the shaft stronger, but you've also made it hit harder. You've added mass without having to make the head bigger. Do you need more stiffness in your shaft? Yes, that's right. The final point, the 5th point, is stiffness, okay? And this often that gets overlooked because very often recreationally, we're actually using poles which are intended for safety. They've got blunt tips on them if we're thrusting in a HEMA context. So we want a bit of flex in the shaft because it makes it safer. Conversely, if we're looking at a reenactment context, then if you go to an English Civil War reenactment somewhere in England or Scotland today, then you'll often see when they're holding their pikes, okay, so they're like this with their pike blocks, their pikes are very floppy. Now, this is partially, you could say, this is actually makes them slightly safer, but bear in mind that they're not actually stabbing each other with the pikes. So when they're doing English Civil War reenactment, and I know that you do this in America as well, then usually the points won't be actually usually be put downwards or put upwards, so they're not in people's faces for safety reasons. So they're not really being used as pikes. Whereas obviously in reality, the pike is a big spear. It's used for stabbing. Now, what you want when you're applying the point to something is you don't want, when the point meets resistance, for the shaft to bend, because then it won't go into the target. It won't be an effective stabbing implement. If every sword bent like a fencing foil, it wouldn't be very good for stabbing with. So you want some stiffness in your shaft. Okay, that's Uncle Matt's pro advice there, pro tips. Right. So not only do you want stiffness in order to make the weapon better at actually stabbing with, but you also want stiffness because it makes the weapon more wieldy. By being stiffer, it doesn't flop around when you move it around. If you're fighting against someone else and using your weapon like this, then you don't want it to be bending around. And also pushing your weapon against an opponent's weapon. If your weapon is floppier than theirs, they'll be able to push yours aside and stab you, which isn't a good thing, you can hopefully tell. So for all of the reasons, you really want a stiff, rigid shaft. And yet again, how is that achieved? By tapering. And in fact, as I say, although this is a 19th century cavalry lance, this is actually a fairly good representation of a pike in many ways. So used two-handed, this is actually a really stiff and responsive weapon. So pikes, or long spears, if they are tapered, tend to be stiffer by virtue of not having too much mass kind of waving around with inertia and flopping around at the tip. Not saying that slightly floppy shafts is necessarily historically completely wrong, because I'm sure there were some historically that were like that. But what I should say is that if you want your pike or long spear to be stiffer, then taper it, because it will be lighter and quicker, more responsive, and it will be stiffer and therefore more effective at doing its job. So there we go, folks. I hope I have sold you on having a stiff, rigid shaft. If you think there are any reasons why you wouldn't want it to be rigid, I can actually think of a couple, and maybe we'll cover that in a future video, then get posting down below. Or indeed, are there any examples of tapered polearm shafts, or other kind of stick-like weapons that you can think of which I haven't covered or mentioned here, or potentially other reasons why you might want them to be like that? For example, penetration, which is another interesting factor that I didn't mention because I don't think it's necessarily one of the primary or strong reasons, but it could be a reason for some weapons. And something like the humble quarterstaff, we usually make them as just a parallel stick, and certainly they existed like that historically, but they don't have to be. They can be tapered at each end, and this makes them much quicker, much more nimble, and stiffer as well. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching. I have been Matt Easton. I will of course continue to be as we go into the new year, and I'm sure I'll see you really soon back on the channel for another video. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.